Oh, okay. Running between meetings, was I you?
Exactly, of course. Good to see you.
It's a great week. How's it going? This has been topic on some, although, you know, you were dealing with Syria. By New York, and you have to. There's positives. Just on that. Just be the body. Exactly. That's what I was just thinking. Exactly. Bringing the news. Pretty exciting. Exactly. Now it's people
On va partager entre deux, c'est ça?
Oui, moi je dis simplement.
Peut-être je vais donner. Okay, shall we start? So, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It is my pleasure and my privilege to welcome you to this first IHL Talks that we have organized in coordination with the Global Migration Center. The IHL Talks are a new initiative of the Geneva Academy, which builds on the bulk of expertise that we have here in Geneva, academic experts, practitioners, members of international organizations, students as well, of course. And the idea behind these talks is to talk about burning humanitarian issues and to allow a broad public to talk with these experts on those issues. So I take the opportunity also to announce you the next IHL talk, which will take place on the 24th of November on the issue of attacks on hospitals and humanitarian workers, which is a trend that we have all witnessed in the past armed conflicts that haven't taken place in different areas of the world. So for this first edition, we have chosen the theme of the movement and displacement of millions of people across borders. And we wanted to talk about the consequences that this movement of population creates, not only from a legal point of view, an operational point of view, but also, perhaps most importantly, from a human point of view. We have here top-notch experts to talk about this. Those experts will be introduced to you by Heba, but allow me to say a few words about Heba Ali. So Heba Ali is the director of IRIN News, which is an independent and authoritative organization that reports news in the context of all types of humanitarian crises. Heba is a Canadian-Egyptian journalist who has reported on various topics of humanitarian issues from conflict zones like Syria, Afghanistan, Iraq, Chad, Libya, among others. So you can see that we are here in very capable hands, and I wanted to thank you all on behalf of the Academy and the Global Migration Center for having accepted our invitation. I very much look forward to our debate today, and I'll leave you the floor. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Nice to be here, although winter is definitely here. My hands, I can barely feel them. So if you see me vigorously warming myself up, that's why. Maybe one note to add to Annyssa's introduction is that my news organization, IRIN, was part of the UN for about 20 years before spinning off last year to become an independent news service. And in fact, we cover migration and refugee issues very closely and have been covering them, including migration to Europe, since 2011. So we were quite surprised when suddenly this became termed in the media as a crisis that had come out of nowhere, because for us this was long in the making and very much foreseeable. The difference perhaps is that we are more used to reporting about refugee crises and refugee movements in other parts of the world, which are, as you may or may not know, the ones dealing properly with a crisis. In Lebanon, refugees make up 1/4 of the population. there are, as I'm sure you'll hear from our panelists, 60 million displaced people around the world today. And the reality is that countries like Chad, like Ethiopia, like Pakistan are the ones carrying the large part of that burden. More than half of the world's refugees are in 10 countries, and they are all in the Middle East, in Africa, and in Asia. So what I hope to do today is to put this crisis in Europe in some perspective on the global scale, and to examine some of the myths and the misconceptions that have been perpetrated in the popular discourse about this issue. We hope you'll have a chance to ask questions of your own, to pick the brains of the experts here today, and to kind of translate what has become a very politicized narrative into some of the more realistic operational questions, and to compare the talk to the reality. Our panelists today, I'll start from the very far left in your case, are Vincent Chetail, who is a professor here at the Graduate Institute and who leads the Institute's Global Migration Center. He's also the editor-in-chief of the Refugee Survey Quarterly and a senior research associate at the Refugee Law Initiative at the University of London. He has a very long list of titles, so I won't go through them all. But he, like our other panelists, has a very solid grounding both in the legal and theoretical aspects of this debate, as well as the practical realities, as having consulted himself for the UN and many NGOs on refugee and migration issues. To Vincent's right is Michele Klein-Solomon, who is a senior policy advisor to the Director General at the headquarters of the International Organization for Migration. Since November, she has served and directed, actually, an initiative within the IOM, which focuses on migrants in countries in crisis. Prior to this, she was, they all have very long bios, so I've tried my best to summarize them. She served as the permanent observer of IOM to the United Nations, which some of you may know has now voted to bring IOM into the UN, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. But she has regularly represented the IOM at high-level forums and international frameworks such as the Sustainable Development Goals. She also advises governments on migration and policy issues, and like everyone on the panel, is a lawyer by training. Lastly, we have Madeleine Garlick, who's the Chief of Protection, Policy and Legal Advice at UNHCR, the High Commissioner for Refugees. She teaches on an occasional basis at Sciences Po and at the College of Europe in Bruges. And excuse my funny French, I'm Canadian. And she's also worked as a fellow at the International Migration Initiative of the Open Society Foundations. She was responsible for UNHCR's liaison to EU institutions for nearly a decade, and so also has that mix of legal and very practical experience. So with no further ado, I'm going to ask a few questions to kind of open up the discussion and frame the conversation, and then we will turn to you. So Madeleine, I think I'll start with you. As I said off the top, this has been labeled as a European refugee crisis, and I'd love your reaction to that characterization. Is this a crisis, and should Europe in the 21st century be able to handle this kind of an influx of people?
Thank you very much, Heba, and let me thank the organisers for inviting me here today to take part in this very timely discussion. I think it's a very important thing for us indeed to question this notion of crisis, which, by the way, I think in media use has been so frequently invoked that it's almost lost its sense of urgency, let alone any real meaning as to what should be the responses and how policymakers should be looking at dealing with the challenges we see. I think what we would say is that we clearly are experiencing a humanitarian crisis in Europe today, given the numbers of people who have drowned in the sea, close to 3,500 this year alone in the Mediterranean, and 4,000 recorded last year, people exposed to disease, to cold and to other hardships throughout Europe. We also see clearly a political crisis. This has sparked disagreements at the highest level of European policy making. And we're seeing logistical crises, people who are seeking asylum who simply can't get access to the means to register, let alone receive a fair and effective determination of their claims. But indeed, is this a crisis of numbers, an overwhelming crisis that Europe is not equipped to deal with? I think we have to question that. If we look in historical perspective, in 1992, the then 15 EU member states, close to half of the number we have now, received well over 700,000 refugees from the former Yugoslavia in 1 year alone. And that was before we had in place large-scale financial programs to help states deal with this, a framework of legislation that should provide for harmonised approaches to this, institutions specially designed to give support to states. Indeed, one could argue that the common European asylum system was put in place precisely to deal with the sort of situation we're dealing with today. The Secretary-General on Monday at UNHCR's Executive Committee called the situation rather a crisis of solidarity, referring to Europe as well as to the wider world. And indeed, I think one can strongly argue that were there more political will to use the tools that Europe has at its disposal, we certainly wouldn't be seeing a challenge on the scale that we're seeing now. I think it's crucial also to put Europe's situation today in a global perspective. You mentioned the situation of Lebanon. It has refugees, a number which, if one were to extrapolate that to Germany, would equate to 20 million Syrians in its territory. There are clearly many other countries in Europe's immediate neighbourhood who are dealing with challenges that are putting strains on them far greater than those which Europe sees now. Even within the European Union, it's been reported that 3 EU member states are dealing with 65% of the asylum seeker numbers as a whole. So clearly, Europe needs to be thinking much more about how it can be sharing its responsibilities more effectively, not only within its borders, but also with other countries in the world that are dealing with challenges on a much larger scale.
I think one of the issues we can get back to a little bit later also is not just a question of scale, but a question of response. And if we look at the response even in camps in South Sudan and compare them to the response in Greece, it's really quite shocking. And I hope we can get into some of those questions. But before that, I wanted to raise a point on terminology. As a journalist, I think I know quite well the importance of words, as Hillary Clinton said during the presidential debate. Words matter. Vincent, I'd like to turn to you. Could you help us understand the difference in legal terms between a refugee and a migrant? And then perhaps reflect a little bit on whether the two are intentionally or otherwise being conflated. And I'll give maybe just one example from a friend of mine who works at the BBC, who admitted to me that the British Conservative government in the UK had instructed the BBC to use the word migrant when describing the flows of people into Europe, so that it paints a certain picture and so that it justifies some of the actions that the government takes or doesn't take. So if we can get your thoughts on that, Vincent, thank you.
Thank you. Yes, I mean, instead of, because migrant is a very generic term, and to me it includes anyone crossing an international border and living in a country other than the nationality. So including, I mean, this is a factual expression. It would be better maybe to refine migrant workers, because here is a distinction between refugees and migrant workers. I mean, this is a traditional distinction invented by states mainly after the Second World War. The rationale is based on the existence of specific instruments, the Geneva Convention for Refugees and the UN Convention on Migrant Workers, plus the two specialized ILO conventions on migrant workers concluded in 1949 and 1975. And this distinction is quite questionable and debatable in the sense that, of course, we have specialized instruments, but the dividing line between refugees and migrant workers is based on the distinction between forced and voluntary migration. Of course, refugees are forced to leave their own country. But in many situations, this could be the same for migrant workers. I mean, many migrant workers are also forced, they have no choice than to leave their own country to have a decent life. So the rationale is debatable. Also in practice, because in practice, in fact, motivations are mixed and the driving forces are mixed too. So this is a legal distinction, but not necessarily reflecting the reality on the ground, given the diversity of motivations, realities, and so on. Another point is that this distinction can give the impression that refugees are entitled to protection, international protection, whereas migrant workers are left to state discretion. This is totally wrong, clearly, but this is in the mind of many decision makers, politicians, and so on. It's true that there are different types of legal instruments, but both migrant workers and refugees are governed by the same general legal framework based on human rights law. Human rights law is the core source of protection for every migrant and everyone in general, and then this general frame of protection is refined by specialized instruments for refugees or migrant workers and so on. And the same can be said at the regional level too, not only at the universal level. So the applicable legal regime is much more nuanced than a mutually exclusive regime. And for instance, I mean, human rights law is also crucial to protect refugees. I mean, in the refugee definition, there is no prohibition of torture, no right to life, and so on. So clearly, there is an added value of human rights law also regarding refugees and migrant workers. And in fact, in practice, but both in law and practice, the same person can be both a refugee or, let's say, an asylum seeker and a migrant worker.
And the reality is that the motivating factors, as you said, can often be blended and hard to distinguish.
Exactly, but quite interestingly, this is a reality, a fact, but this reality is also covered by legal instruments, even if this is not well known, under the ILO treaties on migrant workers. These ILO treaties on migrant workers are specifically applicable to refugees and asylum seekers. So the same person, let's say an asylum seeker coming in Greece, can be, in the same time, an asylum seeker protected by refugee law. If this person is working even as an undocumented migrant, this person does correspond to the definition of migrant workers under ILO and even under the UN Convention on migrant workers, even if there is a distinction to be done regarding the last instrument. And sometimes this asylum seeker can be a migrant worker, but also can be a victim of trafficking, covered by the Palermo Protocol and so on. So clearly, I mean, here there is a danger to focus on this distinction because this can give the impression that refugees are protected, not the other. This is not true. And in fact, both reality and legal instruments are quite are relevant for encapsulating both refugees and asylum seekers.
I think, Michele, you wanted to jump in, and if you could maybe touch on the point to counter Vincent's point. The reality is, though, that migrants do have less legal protection than refugees. And so, yes, while you may be able to benefit from different legal frameworks, to what extent is a migrant more vulnerable?
Well, thank you very much, Heba, and thanks to Annyssa and the colleagues here at the Geneva Academy. It's really a pleasure to be here and to be here with good friends on the podium. So thank you very much for the chance to be with you today and open this discussion. I do want to jump into that terminology debate very firmly and underline what Vincent said, that we're talking about refugees and migrants are human beings, and all human beings are entitled to the protection of their human rights without discrimination. That's the first and most fundamental. Before we get into any consideration of additional rights, additional protections falling under dedicated regimes, like the refugee protection regime for persons who fall within both the 1951 Convention and its 1967 Protocol, and of course the regional refugee instruments, which are so important in Africa and the Americas, which add additional protections. And as Vincent said, also, there are additional sources of law that give enhanced protections beyond human rights protections to certain kinds of migrants or migrants in certain circumstances. He mentioned ILO conventions and labor law. There's also the counter-smuggling and counter-trafficking protocols to the Palermo Protocol, and specifically the counter-trafficking protocol about protections against exploitation and abuse through the trafficking experience. So we have to really try to dispel the notion that there's not a legal framework relevant to the protection of migrants. nor that it's a zero-sum game between refugees and migrants, that refugees are entitled to an additional layer of protection. But what I want to get at, and it's really going to your question, Heba, is in practice that is not always the case, and it's for a very fundamental reason, that refugee protection, you'll find it amazing or funny that I'm speaking to this, so feel free to jump in and correct me afterwards. But refugee law is set up specifically because of the failure of states to perform certain protection responsibilities for their citizens. And so the 1951 Refugee Convention was developed precisely to fill a gap in protection because of the failure of state protection. And that's why it's so important, and that's why the responsibility is both under the convention for UNHCR, for states in carrying them out, are so important because there's a lack of state protection of their own citizens. In the context of migrants, that's not the case necessarily. And the entire framework around migrant protection is not oriented that way. Let me put it a different way. In a perfect world, there would be no refugees. Refugees exist because of the failure of states to protect their own citizens. In a perfect world, there would actually be migrants, but those migrants would move genuinely as a matter of choice and not of compulsion for the many reasons that Vincent said, increasingly climate change, violence, forms of disaster, lack of economic opportunity, exacerbated also by environmental degradation, rights abuses, or simply, but people would have a choice, a genuine, meaningful choice, and their migration would go through safe and legal means, meaning that there would be adequate legal channels to move, and they would be welcomed upon reception in their countries of destination, which would see migrants as an asset, as human beings who bring skills, who bring different cultures, who bring dynamism, entrepreneurship, all kinds of things that is historically the case of the migrant coming to other countries. So we don't need, in the migration area, fundamentally, a protection regime that substitutes for state protection, like the Refugee Convention does. That's not to say that there aren't migrants who are vulnerable, as we've obviously talked about. And just a bit on the numbers there, just quickly, I mean, and we take the same view that UNHCR does about the crisis in Europe. I mean,
women UNHCR don't take the same view about everything, though.
on this one we do.
Just kidding.
Not on the terminology, but we can get into that if you want. But on the question of the crisis, I mean, obviously there is an issue. There is a political crisis. There is a humanitarian crisis. There's a human rights crisis. But it's not beyond, in our view, Europe's capacity to be able to handle it. But coming specifically to the numbers on migrants, you talked about 60 million, 65 million people currently in the world displaced. 21 million of those are counted by UNHCR as refugees outside their own countries, 40-some million internally displaced within their own countries, whether as a result of conflict or natural disasters or rights violations of various sorts. But put in a perspective, the number of international migrants in the world is currently counted at 244 million, within which refugees are counted as part of the 21 million. And that 244 million is nearly double 20 years ago, so greatest absolute numbers ever, but not a huge increase as a percentage of world population. And now migrants make up just a bit over 3% of the world's population. And that's been fairly constant for the last 20, 30 years, slight increase. So the overall numbers are large, but as a percentage of the population of the world, it's not large. That means that most people choose to stay at home and lead productive, safe, we hope, rights-protected lives at home. How do we get from a place where those 244 million are not all voluntary migrants, and their rights are not all protected in practice? And that's your question. Because what's happened, certainly in the European crisis, and I will call it crisis with all the caveats that were said before, is that we are seeing a duality of protect the refugees, send back the irregular migrants, and effectively saying, not looking at what the individual needs, what the individual circumstances, what the individual protection needs are beyond refugee protection. And Madeleine already mentioned the crisis in access to protection and access to asylum procedures. Well, it goes beyond that. That's absolutely an issue. But many governments don't have in place measures to look at other vulnerabilities beyond the refugee protection vulnerabilities that are experienced, whether victims of trafficking or other forms of exploitation and abuse, and also look at whether it's safe to send somebody back to a country, maybe that's not in conflict, maybe that's not persecuting, but nonetheless where it may be unsafe or inadvisable to go back. I'm not suggesting that we do away with borders. We live in a world of nation states. We will continue to live in a world where there are borders, and governments have the sovereign authority and responsibility to manage their borders and to decide which non-nationals come in. But I think we are at a point where there is a crisis in not having adequate policies to deal with the reality of human mobility as it exists today, to facilitate safe, regular, and orderly migration in a way that really matches both labor market needs and people's protection needs beyond those associated with refugee protection. And in practice, that's a major issue.
Can I then, you've made a number of points there, all of which I'd love to follow up on, but let's see what we can get to. For you as UNHCR as a UN agency and IOM soon to be a UN agency, operating in this kind of environment, what are the difficult decisions that you have to make? I mean, there's several fronts here. First of all, in navigating that very blurry landscape of refugee versus migrant and what that means for how you as two organizations that are working in the same space but with different mandates relate to one another without overlapping and stepping on each other's toes. But maybe the more political question is, when you have limited resources and you're deciding between responding in South Sudan or in Yemen or responding in one of the richest continents in the world, how do you navigate the difficult decisions around the degree to which you're kind of playing into the politicization of this crisis by responding in the first place? As you said, shouldn't Europe be able to handle this? So maybe I could just hear from each of you in terms of a humanitarian response, how you deal and think through with those questions. Maybe Madeleine, we can start with you.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Heba. I mean, I think it's you've really touched upon an absolutely key challenge, the question of how to prioritise. It's true that HCR has now a budget that's significantly larger than it has been in previous years, but that's actually not good news, because that's a result of the fact that we're facing ever more needs worldwide in regions of the world where there's been long-standing crises, but also new conflicts that have emerged over the recent years. UNHCR seeks, where possible, to highlight to donors where there are specific new emergencies where we need additional funding. This is something that HCR does regularly throughout the year, issuing additional calls for funding worldwide. But unfortunately, we do see that some crises secure more attention and more political support as well as financial responses than others. It was noted on Monday, for example, that whilst humanitarian aid budgets generally run by UN agencies are funded at around about 50%, a number of those crises in Africa we've seen in recent times, in Central African Republic, in South Sudan and others, are close to a third of their needs, where in Europe, by contrast, we're fortunate enough to have support to the tune of around 50%. So indeed, there is a crucial challenge there. One of the things that we seek to do is to underline to donors that in addition to coming up with additional resources for specific emergencies, that they do seek to give us unearmarked funding to the extent possible, so that agencies like ourselves can be nimble in responding to crises when they arise in ways that mean that we may not necessarily have the time to have a long-standing fundraising process in order to address those. In terms of respective areas of work, I think we'd both agree that our respective agencies, as well as many others, have no shortage of work. There is plenty to go around amongst all of us. And there are extensive coordination mechanisms that have been put in place in all regions of the world now. We've seen a real growth, a real recognition of the vital importance of ensuring that we are working to our respective strengths, drawing on the different skills that our staffs have based on mandate as well as different recruitment patterns. But we have all of the UN agencies which have their respective roles to play in a number of the crises we're dealing with. And of course civil society as well, which has really stepped up over recent years, both international NGOs with large-scale presence worldwide, but also increasingly local NGOs who play a critical role. And when I think, for example, of the Syria crisis right now, the bravery, the courage and the responses of some of the NGOs on the ground is really extraordinary. The Nansen Refugee Award was given 2 nights ago to 2 Greek NGOs that are essentially subsisting on the power of volunteers alone. I don't know where they get their money, but they have very little to operate on, and yet they're still able to deploy extraordinary resources.
It's quite a dilemma, though, because in fact much of the European refugee response has been led by volunteers, and I met many of them who said, where are the international agencies? Why are we the ones at the front line of this crisis when there are many others who are better placed to be able to respond, and they're not here? And yet at the same time, many agencies saying, well, we shouldn't be in Europe because there are many higher priorities and contexts in which the needs are greater, and those governments or countries less well positioned to respond. And so it's really quite difficult in terms of how you make those calls. I'm interested, maybe Michele, in particularly now as you join the UN, the IOM used to be seemed to be more practical, nimble, able to respond quickly. How does joining the UN change the way you'll operate?
With respect to humanitarian response, not much at all. And since 1992, we've been a standing invitee of what's called the Interagency Standing Committee, which is the UN system's coordinated humanitarian response that also brings in the major civil society NGOs that do humanitarian response. So we have always participated as part of the coordinated response at the country level and in the global interagency policy work. So, and I think that in that sense, coming into the UN as a related organization will not change anything on that score in terms of responsiveness, nimbleness, ability to gear up very quickly. And the overwhelming majority of our work, and we have offices in over 150 countries, we have almost 500 locations worldwide, and those are overwhelmingly in crisis prone or experiencing countries, and they are driven by actual practical assistance on the ground. Very, in a bit, I mean, not totally in contrast to UNHCR, but UNHCR uses a lot of implementing partners, works with NGOs. IOM does a lot of response itself. We do, of course, work with NGOs, sometimes in an implementing partner relationship, but sometimes on a partnership relationship. And we actually serve jointly as the co-chairs of the camp coordination, camp management, cluster. I mean, this is really UN speak, I know, but it's basically the UN's effort to create some order in all of the different organizations. And I completely agree with what Madeleine said. There's more work to go around than people to do it. So we're not worried about competition at all, but rather making sure that our responses can be fast, they can be smart, they can be effective where they're most needed. In contrast to UNHCR and sometimes it's seen as an asset of IOM, sometimes it's seen as a liability. We are 97% project funded. So we don't start with a core budget at the beginning of the year and then get to determine the priorities and where to allocate that to. So to go through the process that you've alluded to about deciding where this is the greatest need. The 97% of our activities are based on donor funding to respond to particular situations. Now, obviously, we try to plan and anticipate and ask for multi-year funding as much as possible and to get ahead. But it does mean that we're very much subject to the vagaries of donor assistance. Some of that comes from central UN coordinating funding mechanisms like the Central Emergency Response Fund. We have created internally in IOM a small migration emergency funding mechanism. That was created actually after the Libya crisis, when it was so visible that we're more than 800,000 migrant workers in that context had been left stranded during the Libyan civil war. Most of their embassies had closed, so they didn't have the support of their governments. Many had lost or had their passports confiscated, didn't have identity documents to be able to get an exit visa to leave, no less permission to go elsewhere. And IOM and UNHCR were called in to help support. We evacuated more than 200,000 people to safety, but realized we learned a lot of lessons from that experience, including one that we need to have funds available right away, not wait for donors. So we created this mechanism, fortunately, but also that it's not simply enough to evacuate. And evacuating people to the Central African Republic, to Mali, to Bangladesh, 36,000 people in a short period of time, and bringing back people precisely to the situations that they left without necessarily a change in the circumstances at home, even if it wasn't a non-refoulement refugee-related issue, it could potentially lead to questions about their ability to lead safe and productive lives and the impact on the receiving communities. So, but then just very briefly about IOM entering the UN overall, as I said, I don't think it's going to change much in the humanitarian sphere. I do think it'll change things in other spheres. IOM will now be more systematically a part of the UN country teams at the national level, part of all the relevant coordination mechanisms, and part of the internal decision-making bodies. Very importantly, and I want to stress this, that IOM coming into the UN doesn't change the mandates of any other organizations. It doesn't eliminate ILO's responsibility with respect to labor rights and labor protections, and including in the migration area, or the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights with respect to the protection of rights of all people, and then including the specialized mechanisms for protection of migrant rights. But hopefully what it will do is encourage more collaboration, more meaningful partnership, and an opportunity to together be more predictable and unified in outlook, vision, and how we assist overall.
I realize this is a meandering conversation because there's so many dimensions to this question. I think we've looked at the questions around language and the question around the distinction between refugees and migrants, what that means from a legal perspective and what that means from an operational perspective. I did want to ask Vincent about one particularly controversial deal, which you'll all be aware of, that the European Union signed with Turkey to manage the flow of refugees into Europe. And then I think we'll turn to you for questions after that. Vincent, you described the deal on a recent blog post as treating refugee like cattle. So I'd love for you to walk us through very briefly what that deal consists of, and again, looking at kind of realities versus rhetoric, whether it actually is in accordance with international law.
Thank you. Of course, on the paper, the deal, I mean, it's difficult to say an agreement because there is a controversy on this, but let's say the deal or the statement on the paper is fine. I mean, it underlines due respect for international law, prohibition of collective expulsion, individual examination of asylum requests. But of course, the hidden agenda is to use the controversial notion of safe third country in order to remove all asylum seekers from Greece to Turkey. And here is the major issue. And from a purely legal perspective, Turkey cannot be considered as a safe third country, according to the definition given by Article 38 of the Asylum Procedure Directive, and also under international law, but EU law is more specific in this field. And this is based on several reasons, but the most important reason is that Turkey has ratified the Refugee Convention with a particularly strong geographical restriction. Turkey is bound to give the refugee status to Europeans only, which is good to know for Europeans. But I mean, this is clearly not applicable to Syrians and all refugees outside Europe. So clearly, technically, legally speaking, Turkey is not safe for Syrians and others simply because the Geneva Convention does not apply to them. Of course, I mean, Turkey has adopted a new domestic law for Syrians, but for Syrians only, which means that all the others are not protected as such, legally speaking, and they can be sent to their country of origin. And this is what happens for Afghan refugees, for also the refugees from Somalia and Eritrea. So clearly, this is the main issue. It cannot be considered as a safe third country because of the limit, the very limited ratification. And there are many other reasons. I mean, the protection against inhuman and degrading treatment is debatable for various reasons, but there are many NGO reports mentioning harassment, refusal of admission of Syrian refugees at the Turkish border, and so on. I don't want to go too much into the details. I did this mention of Chetail in link with other. There is another dimension, the deal, one Syrian against one Syrian. Which is quite strange in terms of, let's say, human rights terminology, because clearly they are exchanging persons like products.
In other words, for every Syrian that Turkey will
be so every Syrian sent by Greece to Turkey, the EU will accept another Syrian from Turkey to be relocated. Okay, so and that is why here there is a problem in terms, first of all, ethical problem, because we are dealing with human beings and not
cattle.
Yeah, exactly. And the other issue here again more technical, but there is an indirect violation of non-discrimination. Because in violation of the Geneva Convention and many other treaties and EU directives, simply because this exchange is limited to Syrians only and not to others with similar needs, Afghan refugees, refugees from Eritrea, and so on. So this was in this context. But also there is a major issue here, because the EU is ready to violate its own regulation and also international law on the sake of the so-called refugee crisis. And this is the most disturbing thing, because this is not the good signal to send. I mean, violating refugee law and international law just to avoid entry of asylum seekers. And also, again, as you said rightly before, and also Madeleine and Michele, I mean, there is a refugee crisis, but in Lebanon, in Turkey. In the EU, there is, in terms of statistics, I mean, 1.2 million of asylum seekers have been registered last year, which is, okay, substantial. But I mean, this represents, even assuming that all asylum seekers will receive the refugee status, we are talking about 0.2% of the EU population. And by comparison, Lebanon is hosting the 1/4 of the Lebanese of persons living in Lebanon are refugees. So we are here talking about a crisis for 0.2% of the EU population. Is quite strange when you know what's happened in the same times in Lebanon, Jordan, Turkey, Sudan, and so on.
So in terms of misconceptions, myths, and so on, we've looked at the fact that Europe's crisis is not nearly the crisis that others are dealing with. Michele touched briefly on the fact that actually refugees and migrants can often be a boom for an economy rather than a burden, as is often portrayed. We've talked a little bit about the misconceptions around the roles between IOM and UNHCR. I think we'd like to hear from you guys now. Do we have a mic for the floor, or should I give one of these, or do you need one? And we wanted to give Annyssa some exercise at the very back. And maybe what we'll do is we'll take a few, so if there are any other questions, and then we'll come back to. And yes, if you can introduce yourself and if you're affiliated with any organization.
My name is Artem Korolev. I am a kind of affiliated with the Geneva Academy. First of all, I would like to thank you for the conference. It was very insightful. My question will touch upon one of the legal challenges, which I can see in the title. The other day I read a story about a certain John Thon, a Kenyan guy who fled to Britain, and during his asylum proceeding he confessed to the office that back in Kenya he had killed from 100 to 400 people with a machete. Of course, he fell under exclusion clauses of the Geneva Convention, but because of the British Human Rights Act and because of the Human Rights Safety Net we are all aware about, he was granted asylum status. And as you can imagine, Britain has no jurisdiction to prosecute him. And I think that's one of the legal challenges to this topic of refugees and migrants, because if you flee your country where you committed a serious non-political crime, but you cannot be extradited to this country anyway because of this human rights safety net. Of course, the history of these guys is a little bit particular because if the Convention on Crimes Against Humanity is adopted one day, Britain may have universal jurisdiction to adjudicate these crimes. But what if it is not such a massive crime, but a simple murder of 1, 3, 5 people? I think that's important because these stories, as you can imagine, contribute a lot to political discourse and populism of right-wing parties. And until we have an answer to it, we will have some problems. Thank you.
Annyssa, I think there was another question here, and then the gentleman at the corner. So in the purple scarf, I think.
Yes, for ladies first.
Hi everyone, I'm Alicia from Geneva Academy LM program. Maybe my question is a little bit related to the other guy. The difference between refugee and migrants. We know that the difference, especially nowadays, is blurred really often. But the difference between refugees, so forced migration, and migrants, voluntary migration, it's been used, unfortunately, in a lot of arguments, especially in the judgments and in order to refuse protection to asylum seekers. My question is about the potential use of the principle of non-refoulement, and especially in order to about the complementary, so-called complementary protection system, in order to just sometimes fill this gray area that it happens a lot of times in order to broaden the protection and assure more protection to people who fall in these gray areas.
Thank you. My name is Pedro Mendes. I'm a security sector reform officer with DCAF here at Maison de la Paix. A question maybe to Madeleine Garlick. How much the response has to shift from a reactive humanitarian response to a robust purpose of addressing root causes of displacement? And I'm thinking in particular in security and justice, and transferring or shifting the humanitarian approach to a development approach, maybe with a key ingredient of political accountability internationally.
Okay, maybe we'll tackle those three first, and let's start in reverse order. So Madeleine, do you want to take that last question first?
Certainly. No, thank you very much. They're all extremely pertinent questions. And in fact, we've had developments and discussions over the last month that go directly to some of the questions we've talked about. Perhaps taking the last part of the last question, that of the importance of the link between humanitarian and development assistance, it's a crucial element that is increasingly receiving recognition and acceptance now. It's true that it remains sensitive in some quarters. There are some host countries which in the past have sought to really express the view that development assistance was something traditionally seen as being for their citizens rather than for also potentially benefiting people who have been displaced. But I think it's increasingly now accepted that development programming needs to take account of the effects of refugee movements and migration, and needs to also look at trying to address the needs both of host communities as well as displaced people themselves. In fact, the World Bank yesterday has issued a report that was launched, the Palais des Nations, which I'd strongly commend to anybody who's interested in this issue, which really highlights the potential benefits for host communities in particular of long-term strategic development planning that takes these movements into account. Root causes, again, is a crucial issue. Last year, the High Commissioner for Refugees hosted a High Commissioner's Dialogue here in Geneva in December, which focused specifically on what more can be done there. And even though many actors tell UNHCR that this is not our role, we should not be a political entity, we can't be an entity that is actively seeking to intervene in conflicts, we increasingly see the crucial importance of addressing this if we're ever going to coming close to overcoming the challenges that cause refugees to flee and that create problems worldwide. So we're increasingly seeking to try and work closely with partners who do have the mandates and who do have the capacity in order to achieve more strategic approaches to root causes. It's very important also to recognise, I think, that in the declaration that was adopted by the UN General Assembly on the 19th of September recently, there has been, amongst many other crucial elements there, a recognition of the importance of addressing root causes through multilateral fora, through efforts at bilateral levels, through regional processes, in any ways that this can become a more effective element of international reactions and part of international strategic approaches to displacement. With regards to questions around complementary protection, I think I'd take issue, if I may, with the idea that the distinction between migrants and refugees is blurred. I would say rather that in legal terms we have some very clear elements that we've referred to here today, the absence of state protection for refugees in particular, as Michele has highlighted, being one clear element. What we do see, however, I think, is that there is, in many cases, failure to recognise and to rigorously apply some of the legal concepts that are relevant to both groups. And of course, we see also then linked to that a failure of respect for the legal rights of people all in general under human rights frameworks, but also distinct rights that arise from the different frameworks dealing with migrant workers, with refugees and others. For UNHCR, complementary protection is a good thing, where it is genuinely that, where it complements and where it does not undermine the refugee protection regime. And we've seen, for example, some very positive developments in this field over recent years. The EU in 2004 adopted a directive which provided specifically for a form of complementary protection, going beyond and addressing different forms of exposure to risk and serious harm, apart from persecution in the Geneva Convention sense. For example, dealing with people who are at risk of death penalty or execution, which is contrary to European human rights norms. But we do note with concern that in some cases there is a use by state authorities of complementary protection criteria for people who UNHCR would consider to fall specifically within the definition of refugees. And we worry that in some cases this may be being done, in part because of the different levels of rights that attach to the two forms of status. The EU in 2013 took a positive step in coming very close to harmonising the forms of status that are available to the two groups. There's a new proposal this year, unfortunately, that goes in precisely the opposite direction. And this is not necessarily what UNHCR sees as an appropriate response to increasing arrival numbers. On the contrary, the EU should be looking at ways of ensuring that all people can be given rights which will enable them to integrate and to contribute to host societies more effectively. On security questions, I think you've touched upon really one of the core challenges for the refugee protection regime, but also for migration management more broadly today. All states are very rightly concerned about the security of their citizens in all parts of the world, and ways to address those without raising higher the barriers to entry and keeping out people who are vulnerable and who need protection is really the fundamental challenge we face here. You mentioned that the gentleman in question received refugee status in the UK. I think that's not strictly true, because refugee status under the terms of the Geneva Convention and the equivalent UK laws is not available to people who are undeserving of refugee protection because they've committed war crimes, crimes against humanity, or acts that are contrary to the principles and purposes of the UN. What he may, however, have fallen under is the category of people who are not entitled to refugee status, but who, under human rights norms, can't be sent back to face a risk of torture, inhuman or degrading treatment. There are strategies states can use in order to manage situations like this. The criminal legal system means in many cases that states can prosecute crimes that have been committed abroad, and people can be then punished and held in, if necessary, in closed facilities so that their societies in which they are living are not at risk. This is part of one of the new challenges that we need to collectively find better ways to address. The legal tools, however, in our minds are clearly there and can be used more effectively to protect everybody concerned.
I just want to add two small points. Madeline's done a great job of addressing that. I think your point about the political discourse and when a case like the one that you referred to in the UK comes up, and how that then becomes this emblem of somehow that the system is broken and that government is not doing its job in either protecting its citizens or managing this stuff. And that goes back to the question of the crisis. I think what is very dangerous, and this is a crisis of confidence in the ability of governance to govern and to manage. And when there is that sense that things are out of control, it provides a very ample fodder for nationalist, xenophobic, populist politicians to arise. And I think that crisis is a genuine one, and we're seeing it play out not only in Europe, certainly in my country, the United States, and many other parts of the world. And that's a very disturbing trend. And second point, and it goes to this, is I think that part of what needs to happen in order to reduce that reaction is to make sure that the legal processes work properly, that government officials can explain them, but also to have a more honest debate about both the benefits and the challenges associated with the movement of people. And what I mean by that is that the historically positive contribution of migrants to the societies that they come to, that the crime rates among migrants are generally lower than in the national population, the numbers of terrorists of foreign origin are probably not so high relative to the number of terrorists homegrown. I mean, we need to break these things down, and so that we don't feed this tendency to simply point to the other and as the source of whatever societal ills there are, and at the same time recognize that change and the change that comes about in society when newcomers come in is frightening for some people, and that we need to actively manage that change in jobs. Is this person going to take my job? Well, no. Most of the statistics say that migrants don't displace domestic workers. Yes, in some sectors, but the numbers are really small. Overall, migrants create more jobs than they take from nationals, but we need to, obviously there's, that's a very gross statement. We need to break it down. But at the same time, we need to talk about the cultural changes that come about and not be afraid to engage in a more open discussion about what it means in terms of national identity, and recognize that we're on a path as an international community that was started a long time ago with globalization, where we are going to have, as a norm, more multi-ethnic, more racially diverse, more culturally diverse societies, and those changes need to be embraced and managed. You can't expect the process to happen on its own and turn out well. And that's a real responsibility for governments, communities, all of us in the sector, civil society, to really look at managing the changes that come along and the fears. And last point is the point from the woman in the middle about complementary forms of protection. I think, obviously we would like to see, more robust use of whatever protection means are available for people. And see that there is, while there may not be an appetite by governments in many cases to develop new legal norms, there's certainly problems with enforcement of existing norms, there are efforts to develop more protections in the form of non-binding guidance, really consciousness raising. And I just want to point to two. One was mentioned in my introduction. For the last 2 years, I served as the director of the Secretariat of the Migrants and Countries in Crisis Initiative, which was an initiative by member states to look at the specific situation of migrants in a country that experiences either a natural disaster or conflict, and recognizing that while citizens are affected, migrants are affected, but even more so because of different vulnerabilities that they have, not speaking the same language, maybe their legal status, access to documents, familiarity with the culture. I mean, I'm not going to go into the details, but there's this recognition that there's more that can and should be done for this population, and raise awareness and do something. Same with the Nansen Initiative protection agenda that was developed over the course of the last few years to develop protections for people who are displaced across borders as a result of natural disasters and climate change. And creating now this new platform for disaster displacement. These are positive developments, and they're not to take away in any way from existing norms, but rather as a way to complement those by informal, non-binding guidance, raising awareness, really looking at practical measures that can be put in place to make a difference. And I hope we'll see more of that. And there's a specific call, and I'll turn over the mic, specific call in the New York Declaration from the summit 2 weeks ago for development of guidance on the protection of migrants in vulnerable situations more broadly, and really looking at breaking that down. What does it mean to experience vulnerability, where, and what can be done to reduce those vulnerabilities? I think those are things that we should be encouraging. Thank you.
I will be short, but I'm always fascinated by the fact that politicians, mass media, and public opinion are used to focus on very exceptional situations without a proper understanding of the reality or the broader view. And the debates related to exclusion clauses to the refugee status is a perfect illustration. Because on the other hand, if security concern of states must be taken seriously, they have to register asylum seekers. They have to give the means to Greece and Italy to register asylum seekers, to assess their asylum request in order to identify whether they are covered or not by exclusion clauses, namely whether they have committed or not a crime. So, I mean, the best response in terms of security is to assess asylum requests in order to have a better understanding of the background and possible crimes and so on. And on the other hand, I mean, exclusion clauses is a very marginal concern, an extremely marginal number of persons. We are talking, again, I'm sorry to use statistics, but I mean, this is the best way to have a broader vision. I mean, exclusion decisions represent around less than 0.01% of refugee definition of refugee decisions, okay, under the Refugee Convention. So I mean, this is nothing. I mean, of course, there are issues, but the issues are not so huge in the sense that if the person has committed a crime, this is prosecution. If not, but this person is a threat to public order, then reporting, regular reporting police and so on can be used. So this is our strength, this fascination for the exceptions and not the reality. And the same can be said about the crisis, because in line with what we said, clearly we need a new narrative on migration. Because we are becoming the hostage of populism, electioneering, and misinformation. So we need a new narrative. We need a sound, objective assessment of about the migrants, about their contribution to the economy and so on. And clearly, of course, I mean, this is a major challenge, but I think that this should be taken seriously, the need for a new, positive, rational, objective narrative and understanding about migrants and migration.
So I saw a very keen question here, which will probably be the last. So Annyssa, if we can just, okay. So I think we will do one last round of questions and then we will wrap up because otherwise we'll get kicked out of the room. So the lady in the red shirt.
And if I see that it sparks a lot of interest, which is great. Could you ask brief questions, because
and then I'll ensure the panel gives
time.
Brief answers as well.
And brief answers as well, yeah. So very last one. So the first...
In the red shirt over here, or pink.
Thanks. My name's Caroline Howard. I'm a former student at the Geneva Academy. I can ask a brief question. I don't think there's a brief answer, though. Just in terms of gaps in the law and the legal challenges, we've talked about refugee law and human rights law. I wondered, in terms of international humanitarian law and international criminal law, what the major gaps are really and legal challenges in terms of preventing forced displacement. Obviously, the law prohibits forced displacement in international armed conflict, but how adequate is that prohibition? And similarly for international criminal law, it has been prosecuted as a crime, I know, a lot by the ICTY in the past, but not recently by the ICC. So could you say a little bit, perhaps, Vincent, about the reasons why forced displacement hasn't been prosecuted by the ICC to date? Thank you.
And then I think, yes, just in the same row here.
Hi, I came from the University of Seville. I'm sorry because it's not a short question, but I will try to do it. Michele Klein-Solomon was talking about the borders and the sovereignty of the state. We are talking about the agreement between Turkey and Europe, and we are talking about the development as a better response to the crisis of refugees and the migrations. All of these questions are related to the export of the migration control as a way to export juridical responsibility from Europe or from the North state to other states. And that scares me a lot, because in international law you can't export your own responsibility, and it's about that the question. If we see the investment of the European Union in border security or development, and we compared it with the investment in the asylum seekers care in Europe, in Greece or in Italy, we see that the difference is huge. Is 17,000 millions in border security and development, and less than 800 in care of the people who have arrived. Sorry, then that's the question.
Great, thanks. And if you can just hand it right behind you, yes.
Thank you very much. My name is Paul. I am a student of the Transitional Justice Master at the Geneva Academy. I will try to be brief. But, with all due respect, when we're stuck at the definitions of the both migrants and refugee, but both of them, including the internal displaced persons, is now becoming a major source of the modern slavery, which is a very big thing, $150 billion illegal profit per year. And if we were to say that the system of the migrations and refugees is maybe failed, but what about the second layer of protections? Is it working, or is it also failed? What I'm saying is the criminal prosecutions of the human trafficker and other type of framework that you can do it in the second layer to prevent those people falling into a deeper darkness when they already trying to leave their place from war or anything else. So that's in short. Thank you.
Sorry, so the protections for IDPs that might be subject to human trafficking?
Both IDP, refugee and migrant, all of them are subject to modern slavery, not just human trafficking.
So I think just to save time, I will direct the first question around why forced displacement is not prosecuted under international criminal law to you, Vincent, and then we can tackle the other questions.
Okay. Yes, we mentioned later the need to address the root causes. And due respect for IHL is part of the picture, because clearly due respect for IHL is the best way to prevent forced displacement. IHL is quite poor for protecting refugees as such, but quite detailed for protecting IDPs and victims, civilian population, and so on. So clearly, better respect for IHL is part of the picture. And also, there is another added value you mentioned. I mean, even if we are at the very beginning now, but we can imagine more and more prosecution before the ICC in link with forced displacement. Because after all, I mean, this is governed by, this can be considered as a war crime, and sometimes a crime against humanity. I recently published a study on this, arguing that, I mean, the crime against humanity can be transposed into the migration context. And I mean, the best candidate, I'm sorry to say so, are Australia and Dominican Republic. Clearly, because of their systematic policy of detention, deportation, that triggered several condemnations by the Inter-American Court of Human Rights for Dominican Republic and many UN treaty bodies, but also UNHCR and so on. So clearly, there is a new avenue for protecting migrants and prosecuting abuses against migrants. And maybe a few words on IDPs or later? Okay.
So if Madeleine will speak to the second question.
Yeah, perhaps if I may cheat, however, and just follow on the point as to regarding prosecutions. Of course, in many cases, the challenge to prosecutions is lack of evidence. And so in that regard, I would only encourage academics who are interested to continue to do empirical research, to gather whatever data you can that can potentially perhaps also serve as sources and help these efforts, because it really needs to be well documented. As regards the question of exporting legal responsibility, this, of course, is not something that's envisaged under international refugee law. The preamble, paragraph 4 of the 1951 Convention on the Status of Refugees, refers to the urgent need for international cooperation. And there's been much in the 19 September New York Declaration about sharing responsibility. But the opposite of that, of course, is seeking to shift responsibility, and this is not something that's permissible in any way with regards to refugee protection or the protection of rights of others who are the responsibility of states whose obligations have been triggered. We have, of course, the judgment of the European Court of Human Rights from 2011 in the case of Hirsi and others against Italy, which established very firmly that states may be responsible for human rights breaches outside their own territory in cases where they exercise control and jurisdiction over people And so it's not so simple for states to act outside their borders anymore and say that they are not somehow bound. As regards actions by the European Union, for example, in working with third countries, with regards to particularly investing in building their capacities, actually HCR thinks this is a good thing. The European Union should be working closely with partner countries to try and strengthen their infrastructure, to try and work to help them build institutions and legal frameworks. But they should be doing that in line with international human rights norms. The European Charter of Fundamental Rights, of course, applies outside the European Union and binds EU member states and institutions. So there is a very clear legal obligation to respect the principles of that charter, which include, amongst other things, of course, in Article 18, the right to asylum. What we see in many cases is that EU funds are being used to develop protection systems, and indeed we agree with that. People should be able to get protection in more countries in the world than national capacity provides for at present. But this does not mean that in any way Europe's responsibility for people arriving at their shores or in their territory or invoking their responsibility otherwise are reduced. And that's a crucial distinction that has to be borne in mind. As for the disproportion between investments in border management and protection and human rights institution building on the other, this is indeed a very serious question of prioritisation, but it's a political question, unfortunately. I don't think we've got any legal arguments to address that. But of course, all voters in European countries' elections are encouraged to think hard about this, and if this can be something that they can advise their leaders to do in a more strategic way, then that can only be welcomed. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. And just very briefly on the last questions, and certainly the situation of IDPs is greater in numbers now than the situation of refugees, almost double the number of IDPs, and more complicated in the sense that internally within their own countries and questions of governments granting the ability of the international community to access and to provide assistance. So not saying that refugee situation is not challenging, but IDPs is even doubly challenging on those issues. And it's not changing. So yes, there's a real crisis with internal displacement, no question, both for conflict and natural disaster and other related reasons, and some of it quite protracted, without a doubt. On the questions of trafficking and slavery, trafficking is in vogue these days, and not in a good way. In vogue in the sense that there's more awareness of it, and that's all to the good, and more cases are being identified. I'm not sure that we're doing such a great job in reducing the incidence of trafficking or and protecting people who are subject to trafficking, nor prosecuting the perpetrators. And in the first instance, I mean, there's been good development since the development of the Palermo Protocol on trafficking in 2000, widespread ratification, but not such widespread implementation in national laws. You need national laws to criminalize the acts that constitute trafficking, and then that's a first step, and that's a step that's not been taken by nearly enough governments around the world. But even with that, the number of prosecutions are absolutely minuscule. It's just not happening. Partly it's the evidence-related issue, partly it's protection-related issues, and partly it's just so hard. And I think there's got to be a much greater investment in finding a way to hold accountable the people who are taking advantage of others in this. And of course, the cases of modern slavery is even an extension of that. Trafficking for a long while was seen as sort of sex workers or sexual exploitation, and somehow seen as almost people's fault for engaging in that kind of activity. I think fortunately public sensibilities overall are changing, that a lot of the exploitation is false advertising. People expect they're going for jobs as waitresses or whatever it may be, and then find that actually they're put into slave-like conditions, forced into sexual activities. But there's also, and this is my last point, there's a lot of labor-related trafficking, labor exploitation, not just sexual, and it's equally relevant for men as for women. So the issues are pervasive. We need more awareness raising and more action to actually protect victims and hold the perpetrators accountable. And since this is probably the last time I'll have the microphone, I just want to stress that I agree fully with what Vincent said before about the need for a different narrative on migration. It is absolutely essential, and it's part of what opens the political space to take better decisions. So these things are related and really fundamental. Thank you very much.
Okay, so if I'm to try to pull that together, what I hear is that in fact there are increasing avenues for legal protection of all types of people on the move, whether it be IDPs, refugees, or migrants. But that, however, they are not consistently applied, and that they are, as we've been discussing, quite subject to politicization. And maybe to end on a positive note from Madeleine, that we all have a role to play in countering that politicization, and you as academics or diplomats, but also just as regular people in the language we use, in how we vote. You know, we're part of this system as well. So hopefully that leaves you with some hint of optimism in an otherwise gloomy picture. I will hand over to Annyssa. Thank you to the panelists. Thank you to you for your questions. And I'm sure she will fill you in on the next IHL Talks.
Well, thank you very much to all of you. Really, it was really great. I'm really sorry that we had to cut the time like this, but we have a limited time with regard to reservation of the room. It was fascinating. Thank you also for your questions. And so the next rendezvous, if I may say, will be the 24th of November at the Humanitarian in the ICRC to talk about attacks on a hospital. Thank you again, and have all a nice afternoon.